right, well, welcome everybody. I still see there's people coming in, but that's all right. I think it's a good time to get started. Welcome to another expert webinar series that Golden Shovel's been putting on. And today I am absolutely thrilled to have the guests with me. We're gonna be talking about the new reality of economic development. And today we have both Jon Roberts, who's the principal and managing director at TIP Strategies. Hi, Jon. And Anatalio Ubalde, who's the co-founder and managing director of GIS Planning and SizeUp. Now, I know people toss around the word thought leadership nowadays. It's pretty common. You hear it tossed around here and there. Everyone wants to be a thought leader. But when I think of thought leadership, I'm thinking of really original ideas. People that have access to lots of data. They have access to lots of different scenarios. And both Jon and Anatalio are I'd say some of the top in our industry as far as not just seeing the data and the patterns, but coming up with original thinking about what's going to happen. And I think today you guys are in for a really big treat for today's presentation. So we're going to have Jon present for a little bit, Anatalio will present for a little bit. We're going to have a little discussion about the things they share, and we're going to open it up for questions today. So I guess without further ado, let me pass it over to you, Jon.
Thank you. And in my case, good morning to everyone from Bend, Oregon, where I'm spending a good part of the summer. And I'm thrilled to be here. I think we have about an hour altogether. Aaron, is that right? My plan is to take about 50 minutes of it and leave 5 for Anatalio and 5 for questions and answers. And I hope that's all right with everyone.
That'll work great.
Actually, I'm eager to hear what Anatalio has to say as well. And I'm eager to hear your questions, because the first thing I want to begin with before I go to the presentation is to make a disclaimer. If you can imagine a thought bubble over my head, that thought bubble says, don't listen to anything I say. I don't really know what I'm talking about. That sense of uncertainty around the world in which we find ourselves is probably this disclaimer worth making. Having said that, I think there is a value in us sharing what we have heard from our clients and from others across the country. So I'm going to share this presentation with you, and I know that you'll be able to ask questions as we go along. So I don't mind if you have anything really pressing and it pops up. I'm happy to address it. So very briefly, we'll skip the self-promotion and just show you these slides. TIP has been in business now for 25 years, and we really have a major national profile. We're actually in a fortunate position where we've been adding staff in response to all of the activities. And I think the most significant for those of you who have followed TIP is that we brought Tracy McDaniel on as our president, and Tracy is the past chair of IEDC, and really one of the most foremost people in the profession, having worked for governors in New Jersey and Texas and elsewhere. And we have an extensive portfolio on resiliency, but I want to talk about trends. I want to talk, and Bart and Alex and some of the others that I see are on here. I'm going to try to make this a little bit different. That's Bart Phillips up there in the state of Washington, and Alex back home in Austin, Texas. I want to put a different spin on some of the things that you've heard us talk about before. And what I want to do is to really have a better understanding of the kinds of trends that have been rolling out over the last 50 years, really, and to show how much they've accelerated. And I want to stress the fact that these changes that we're experiencing really present an entirely new challenge to economic development organizations, unlike any that they've seen before. This one you are all familiar with in varying degrees. The only sector of our economy since 1970 that has shown a decline in employment it has been manufacturing. But the real story behind manufacturing is not the decline in employment, but the productivity gains. So think about this chart that you're all familiar with in terms of what the current COVID-19 pandemic signals going forward. And then the other one that you've all seen me present, many of you have seen me present, is the nature of the recovery from the previous Great Recession. And that was a recovery fueled almost entirely, and it's really hard to wrap your head around this, by employees that have a college education or more or higher. This is really quite extraordinary. And if this pattern holds as a part of the recovery from the ongoing recession, then the inequity that this inherently represents will be more profound than anything that we've experienced in our lifetime. So that's the background. And then along comes a pandemic. And Anatalio, if you're as sick of seeing pictures of this virus as I am, then please raise your hand. This is really enough to make you sick. I'm sorry, that's a terrible pun, but it is that bad. So 3 crises are converging on us right now. That's really the theme of my talk. And I think you're all familiar with these crises. The pandemic itself, with COVID-19 disrupting our established patterns, the economy going into what is, for all intents and purposes, a global recession, and then the Black Lives Movement, the impact of social justice issues directly and in recovery and growth. And let me illustrate what I mean by that. I've been texting with Todd Battle. My friend Todd is the Economic Development Director in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Alex and I worked there some number of years ago. We've stayed in contact with them. The situation in Kenosha from an economic development perspective, never mind the moral and social implications of this, are profound, are absolutely profound. And the distress that that's causing the community. If you've looked at the newspaper today, there have been 2 additional deaths overnight in Kenosha. The good part of the downtown, wineries, wine shops that I frequented and had dinner at, have been burned to the ground. Todd's own office, which it was the direct result of strategies that we implemented, including bringing jockey underwear people downtown into downtown Kenosha. That's been gutted. It's really tragic. And so these crises are all hitting us at the same time, and with it, an acceleration of existing trends. And I'm not going to talk about all of these. I'm going to focus on just one that isn't even up here in detail, and that's the office market, the commercial office market. But please bear in mind that all of this is against the background of the social inequity that we saw resulting from the previous recession, and that we anticipate will be even more profound as a result of this latest series of crises. So let's just talk about one near and dear to the heart of economic developers, which is supply chain restructuring. And that is a movement away from the cost and efficiency model that we had previously seen into one that is committed to resiliency. Now, what drove that in the past, before the COVID-19, before all of the things that have happened, was in large measure trade policies, immigration restrictions, and other factors. Now, politically speaking, you know we're going to have an election in November. And if for those of you who might have thought that there would be a change in trade policy, everything that is coming out of the Democratic platform to this date suggests a continuation, by and large, of the same policies that are currently in place with the administration that we have, which is to say, in America first, bring American manufacturing back to the U.S. That does not look as if there's going to be any significant change. So I think there's a very real possibility here that the reshoring of industries will, at least from a political and trade position, increase. Obviously, that's not true of immigration restrictions if we have a change in administration, but it will be true of trade policy. Now, I'm going to, excuse me for jumping around here. I want to look at the other really significant trend that is really the one I want to spend the most time on, and that is the ability to work remotely. Now, what we have been saying here at TIP is that this is a giant beta test of our ability to work remotely. COVID-19 has, for better or worse, given us that opportunity. And what we are seeing is that we passed that test. We're proving that we can, in fact, be productive and work in a remote environment. Now, that's obviously not true for everyone, but it's for those that can work remotely, we've proven that it's efficient to do so. And this particular chart that you're looking at looks at the percent of office workers who anticipate that they will work remotely at least 1 day per week. Now, this was done back in June, toward the end of June. And after COVID-19, it looked like over half of office workers said that they would work remotely at least 1 day per week. I think that is extremely conservative at this point, extremely conservative. And of the 72% of office workers who would like to work remotely at least 2 days a week, I think that's going to hold steady. And if it's true, and if employers themselves, and we'll talk about this in a moment, follow this pattern, then among the cascading effects as a result of this is a 40% reduction in traffic. 2 days out of 5 is 40%. So these are the kinds of considerations that this convergence of crises brings upon us. And I really want to stress that it's no longer, at least from an economic development standpoint, it's no longer about the pandemic. It's really about the changes that are now possible, that this crisis has made possible. That is our challenge as economic developers. Now, of course, one of the things that you're thinking correctly is that this is only true for a certain percentage of workers, those who can work from home, not those who can't. But even among those who theoretically can work from home, we have to look at it from a racial and ethnic perspective. And in this, from this perspective, you'll see that this unevenness and the potential social inequity, and I would say not potential, but already occurring inequity is upon us. And you'll see that of all jobs compared to remote jobs, the differential among Anglos is almost zero. In Hispanics, it's over 8%, and among African Americans, it's over 5%. In Asian American population is actually 7.2% to the positive. So the ethnic makeup of remote job occupations breaks down very differently across ethnic lines. And for those of you who are interested in it, we have put together an occupational risk tool that we can share with you. You can contact me later, but we have mapped out the entire United States by zip code that shows occupational risk based on exposure to COVID-19 and the likelihood of those jobs actually disappearing. And we can talk about that later. Looking at a couple more trends, one, of course, is retail sales. And what's so shocking to me about this is not the steady growth of retail sales over the last 20 years. This is ending in 2019. But that at the end of 2019, only about 12% of all of the sales were online. That to me is absolutely amazing. I thought it was higher until our analysts pulled this together. And I think it would be unrealistic to assume that not only that trend is not going to increase, but that it will increase by an order of magnitude. So when we see the figures at the end of 2020, not at the beginning of 2020, if this jumps as much as 10%, it will come as no surprise. What you're seeing, in effect, is a compression in time, a compression of things that would have played out over 20 years, now playing out over as little as 1 year. So in other words, it took 20 years to go from no online sales to speak of to 12%. I think it's entirely likely that the next year will accelerate at the rate that we normally would have spent 10 years accelerating, 10 to 20 years. Now, at the same time, there are some slowing trends. And I think when we look at these slowing trends, that will affect us unevenly across the country. Obviously, global trade, global foreign direct investment, down 40% in 2020 already. That trend is likely to accelerate. Everything that we have seen the studies that we have looked at shows that downward trend will continue and slow further. Tourism and hospitality, I think, will be uneven. Small business startups and expansion already on a downward trend. I know that comes as a shock to some of you, but new business startups have actually been at the lowest level in 2019 and 2020 than they had been over the previous 15 to 20 years. There's no reason now to think that that will increase either. And so this has, I'm going to start making the connection here to the kinds of programs that we run as economic developers. And then I think one that's very much on your minds, and I haven't looked at the current attendee list, but the question of urban migration. Is this a slowing trend or not? And those of you who read the New York Times saw that Jerry Seinfeld had a quirky and funny article just yesterday on basically saying, don't write New York City off. Rumors of its demise are premature, and that those who've moved to Florida, well, good riddance. That's Jerry's take on it. Now, I think the reality is it's a little bit more complicated. And one of the things that we want to look at is what the nature of that out-migration is. JLL, Jones Lang LaSalle, just released a report today saying that they expected more rapid growth in secondary markets over major urban markets. Those are some of the things I hope we can discuss at the end of my presentation. Now, but I want to return to a moment to the question of job vulnerabilities here. And what you see is what you would expect, that the occupational groups that are most vulnerable are the ones that have the most human interaction. I mean, that's a really perverse way of looking at it, but that's largely true. Now, the exception to that, of course, is farming. Ag is absolutely necessary. But take a look at where the occupations are that are having the least impact: management, professional related services, and so forth, office and administrative support. But again, the composition of those occupations are largely Anglo. Now, I want to focus for one moment here on commercial real estate, specifically the office market. I was on the phone this morning with Cushing Terrell and with Jones Lang LaSalle talking about the office market. And for those of you who have treated this as a beneficial byproduct of the creative class, what Rich Florida so famously announced now well over a decade ago, and this was where the creative class lived. And so we, in the economic development world, in our hunt for talent and in our desire to see benefits coming from taxable commercial real estate, are really in the office market, are really having to rethink this. And in the process of rethinking it, now the reason I'm showing Google here is because this is the Google headquarters in Austin, where pictures I took when I gave a talk there last year. And so I've been talking to the people involved in Google headquarters in Austin, and they are saying that they're moving ahead for now on that the completion of that building. However, they are simultaneously saying to their workers, you no longer need to come into work. And if they no longer come into work, think of what all of that, all the implications that have on commuting, on parking, on productivity in general, which we've shown that we can do. Long-term leases are going to be affected. What does the notion of workers at a desk mean if you can work from home? So really what I'm teeing up for discussion is my supposition for now, let's just call it a thought experiment, that commercial real estate in the office market, as we have known it, is going to come to a virtual halt. Now, the fact that Google is moving ahead may belie that. The fact that REI, in its headquarters up outside of Seattle, has essentially walked away from a multi-million-dollar investment makes the argument. So we will need to give some real thought to this and what it means in our economic development strategies. So I'm going to end a little bit over time, but on a question of how to respond to all of these things. What do economic development organizations need to be thinking about as this new reality hits them? And the first way to think about it is that traditionally you have been told to stay in your lane. You have been told to do the things that economic developers do, which is incentive-driven site selection entrepreneurship and business expansion and retention to support that. That's our lane. But now, with the social crises that we're facing, we have to ask ourselves, how wide is our lane? How deeply do we have to immerse ourselves in questions that go way beyond traditional economic development? And the answer is our lane is much wider than we thought it was. But when we get outside of it, the water's deep. The water is very deep, and it's unfamiliar to us. And so the role that we play in this larger perspective is one that we're going to have to give a lot of thought to. Now, this is the slide. Some of you will want this deck. I hope one or two of you will find value in this deck. This slide will not be in that deck because this is inherently controversial. To say to quit looking for solutions sounds like, well, we're at the end of the rope. We're not at the end of the rope. The reason that I am putting this slide out there and saying that we need to quit looking for solutions is that it makes no sense to look for solutions if you posit the question in the wrong way. If what you're trying to solve for is something that has already passed you by, then there's no point in looking for a solution. Instead, we're better off asking the right questions. The right questions are, where are we now, really, to assess your vulnerabilities in this series of accelerating trends? And then to ask yourself, how do we restart the economy equitably? Now, I want to stress this equitable point because I was looking at the office market and commercial real estate. But what about residential real estate? Now, I'd like both Aaron and Anatalio to weigh in on this at the end of my presentation, because this is a little embarrassing and a little shocking. But here in Bend, any house that goes on the market between $1 and $1.6 million is off the market within a week. It sells that quickly. It's extraordinary. So I thought, is this some freak accident here in a little town of 90,000 that's not on an interstate and doesn't have all that great air connections? What's going on? So I started calling others around the country, in Boulder, in Asheville, in Ann Arbor. And this residential real estate pattern is following the same one in all of these college towns and basically resort and retirement areas. And the fact that you cannot sustain an economy equitably when you're driving home prices up that were previously selling for $300,000 to $400,000 to $1.2 and $1.4 million, that's obvious. And then finally, when this is over, where will we be? So this continuation of asking the right questions includes things like this. How do we modify our activities and programs? What new things should we be doing? How do we enable remote work? This is the tools and space question. And can we guide local governments to become the customer? What role will government itself play? And most importantly, can we build social equity into all of our programs? The bottom line is that you're not going back to where you were. This has nothing to do with whether we get a vaccine or not. When the social unrest, which we pray will happen soon, begins to die down, when the economy recovers, you are still not going back to where you were. You're not going back to where you were because the opportunity to do things more efficiently that the virus has brought about will mean that both businesses and workers will not accept the old reality. So we are really, I'm very near the end now, Anatalio, and I'm eager to hear what you have to say. But I want to say that there are three things that we need to pay special attention to that begin to define what our new strategies look like. One is that what will lead us out of the recession will be technology. Innovation will play an increasing role in addressing all of the targets that we have previously had in front of us. Efficiency. My very first conversation when we went into the crisis with Mike Haddad from Schreiber Foods, which is one of the largest privately held, it's a multi-billion-dollar cheese distribution company out of Wisconsin. What he said to me was that Schreiber had begun to look at all of the physical interactions among its workers and ask themselves which of those interactions are really necessary. And what does it mean to eliminate the redundancies within that work environment? And that's precisely what they began doing. And there's no going back from that. There's no more likelihood that we will go back from that than that you would rather stand in a long line at a bank waiting for a teller instead of using the ATM. You won't go into the bank unless you have some special need. The ability to get cash out of the ATM has changed your life entirely. That efficiency that you now accept is going to ripple out across multiple industries. It will change the way that we target industries and the way that we do economic development. And finally, consolidation. You saw those trends already. You will see them speed up at an even greater rate. So I'm going to stop here because I realize it's already 11:30. My goal was 15 minutes. And Anatalio, I've left you 5. But I think you can take it a lot longer than that. I'm going to stop the screen share, and I think we're going to take all the questions at the end instead of now. Is that right, Aaron?
Yep, that's right. So let's,
okay.
Anatalio, you got 4 minutes left.
John, I'm still.
I hope that's not true. Before I mute myself, we want to give Anatalio just as much time.
John, I'm still waiting for the part where you are controversial. I didn't see that part happen yet.
Well, there's some truth to that, isn't it? Isn't there?
That's just the reality. So thank you all. I see the numbers of people who are here. It's pretty amazing. And thank you all for joining and taking some time with us today. So my name's Anatalio Ubalde. As Aaron mentioned, I am the CEO of SizeUp and Managing Director of GIS Planning. A lot of the information that I'm going to share, the longer version, where the answers and solutions are, a lot of those things you can find with some of my writings that you can find on my LinkedIn page, and that's a great way to connect with me.
Just so you know a little bit more about me, both of my companies are software as a service that serve the economic development profession. SizeUp helps economic development organizations better serve their local and small businesses by providing deep market research and business intelligence so that the local businesses can make smarter decisions based on data. And GIS Planning helps companies and site selectors identify the optimal locations to grow in your community. Both companies have clients all over the United States, and in the case of GIS Planning, also all over the world.
So the first thing I want to talk about in terms of changes that have happened in economic development, the largest of all the changes is this hyper-focus on assisting local businesses. The economic impact of coronavirus really revealed itself in a very personal and local way. It's the businesses in our towns, it's our neighbors, it's our family members who are getting impacted. And what we're discovering is like, what is the most important economy to us? It's the one that is local. And so the response of economic developers is also local. The numbers that you're seeing in front of you on the screen is from a survey of economic developers. And you see like, what has changed? What's the highest priority? It's about supporting local businesses. Almost everything else barely even registers. So basically organizations, even ones that were completely focused on attraction, are now focusing on local businesses. And I think that John made a good point related to these issues of how our organizations are changing. So I think that this is really a transformative change in economic development. Another issue is that there is a decoupling of jobs and business location. The old way of thinking about job creation and economic development was that it came from either 1, business expansion, 2, entrepreneurs opening up new businesses, or 3, business attraction. Now, most of the net new job creation comes from local businesses. However, a lot of economic development organizations spent much of their time on business attraction. That's just been a tradition in our profession. But because of the coronavirus pandemic, many businesses have learned they do not need to expand with new facilities. So like there's this idea that there is a building and that building sits in your community, and then people go there to get their jobs or do their work. But this has changed because now companies are seeing there's an opportunity to hire remote workers anywhere in the world to grow their workforce. And this is really an opportunity for many tier 2 regions so that they can get jobs and increase wealth in their communities, but not necessarily by the business being there, but by their residents getting work. This also has some benefits, I think, politically, because instead of bringing in a business that potentially is going to employ people who are from outside of the community, this is this is really about the local people themselves. This is the old model, right? The old model of 1930s jobs, and how you get them is through business attraction. You see the Mississippi model, which is where a lot of our profession started with. But now in 2020, it's really about expansion, entrepreneurship, and the skills of our local workforce. Another change is that the digital transformation of economic development, look, we knew that this was inevitable. The competitive advantages of technology, they're simply too powerful to ignore. And for this, Victor, can you throw up the survey, the first one? All right, so you guys can vote. So who led the digital transformation of your economic development organization? Let's vote quickly now. Victor, I can't see any of the results coming in, so you're gonna have to decide when you close this out and show us the results.
Sure, no problem. In just 1 sec.
All right, so we have a lot of CEOs who are on this. That's a joke. That's the problem with webinars. Nobody gets to laugh along with me. Okay, so I think this is the thing, is that coronavirus has really accelerated this digital transformation of our organizations, because kind of over time we've been adopting software, and whereas temporarily maybe we could survive without some of the technological tools, but now we're just as organizations disadvantaged if we don't have this. If you look from the survey in terms of how people have changed their work, look at number 3 and number 4 are both about using technology to serve businesses in your community, and then also the technology you need to do your jobs. I'll share, because these are some of the technologies that economic development organizations are adding. Things like SizeUp, they're using Lab Tech for learning in their online institute. GIS Planning has launched Zoom Business, which is helping promote the businesses that are open. Golden Shovel has Place VR for remote tours and for interaction using virtual reality, and FDI Markets to track what's going on in foreign direct investment. And I can say personally, and in terms of my own experience, the amount of economic development organizations who are rushing now to catch up so that they have tools like the ones that I'm showing here, or like my experience with SizeUp, because the focus is so much on small business and local businesses that are in trouble, so many economic developers are now moving in this direction. So we may think that transformation is a long way away, but the reality is COVID has just really changed that. The other thing is that we're moving into more long-term and systemic economic development solutions. And Jon talked about this, right? So much of how economic development has been in the past has really been transactional. We do a real estate deal, we attract a business, a company opens, and we use financial incentives. But really effective economic development is moving in a direction about what is long-term solutions for the future that address these problems. So looking at systemic issues, what are our local assets, and how do we collaborate? And also following the discussion that Jon had about staying in our lanes and what is our responsibility, is we have for so long said, well, that's not economic development. But there's no way to think about economic development or recovery or improving the economic realities of our community without addressing these things that impact economic development so much, such as housing affordability, healthcare, schools, environmental justice, safety, technology infrastructure and literacy, gentrification, and food deserts. Another big impact as a major trend is economic inclusion. And so who is it that we're serving, and how well are we serving them? So let's look at the data. And so as the Black Lives Matter movement has gotten more traction and it's more in front of people, well, the data shows why. You look at the wealth gap between Black and white, or Black and white and Hispanic, and you can see it's so massive. You can even see so in the chart that's in the upper right-hand corner. You can see that for those who came out of the last recession, but for African Americans, they're still in the last recession. And education hasn't been the equalizer. You can have a bachelor's degree as an African American, and your average wage is still going to be less than someone who is white with a high school education. You can also see that it's impacted coronavirus has impacted Black businesses twice as hard as white businesses. And while unemployment, so for African Americans, has historically been twice as high for Black workers as white workers, even looking at how things are being impacted because of coronavirus, look who's being impacted the most. And Jon's data also talked about this. We also need to be accountable for what we have done as economic developers, because we have helped enable a lot of this disempowerment. Certainly not all, but pieces of it, through programs such as urban renewal, which in San Francisco, the city that I'm from, as James Baldwin explained, that urban renewal means moving the Negroes out. It means Negro removal. So we need to fix some of the policies that we have created that have resulted in this inequality. Now, this is not just a Black issue, it's also a class issue. So if we look at annualized lifetime incomes, and this is of men, just to be specific, what you'll see is, and this is looking at 1957 to around 1983, that median wages have actually gone down. So if you're in the middle class, things really haven't changed for you. But if you were in the top, in the 95th percentile, things are going better. So you say, okay, well, that's up to the 80s. What's happened since then? Well, you look that the bifurcation, the distance and gap has just grown. And even though it tracked along up until about the 80s, that's really where things, you see the biggest changes in income inequality. You can also see this in terms of the share of total wealth that middle-class people have. If you look at the charts on the right, when it actually comes to wealth, the top 1% have 39% of all of the wealth. Then the next 9%, so we're still in the top 10%, have the next 39%. So 90% are sharing 23% of the wealth. So it's significant in terms of who has what. And to be even more specific, the 26 richest people now have the same wealth as the poorest half of the entire global population. This is about concentration of wealth in few hands. Jon did such a good job talking about supply chain vulnerability. I think I'm not even going to say anything except for the fact that it's become an opportunity. A lot of economic development organizations are realizing that businesses are moving from just how can I do things as cheaply as possible to how can I have a level of reliability and security that I can access the goods that are necessary to make my products. Another trend is about automation acceleration. And this is going to be a little bit counterintuitive. So for those of you who can see me, think about it this way. We're in a recession. The common wisdom would say, well, wages are going to go down. So why do we replace these jobs with computers or software? But for businesses, revenue, okay, so if this is what I'm paying relative to my overall costs for my business for people, and my revenue is up here, then great, right? But because of the coronavirus and the recession that is happening, as my revenue is dramatically going down, my relative cost of people is actually now higher. So what am I going to do? Well, I as a business person then say, okay, I've got to figure out a way to reduce this cost. How do I do that? Through automation. Here's what the data shows is that through the last 30 years, all of the recessions that have happened have accelerated automation. And it's very likely going to happen now. What does this mean for us as economic developers? Well, if we're being measured based on job creation and automation is coming, well, this creates a new situation and challenge for us because the things that we're being measured on are going to be harder for us to accomplish. You can see here geographically where automation puts people at risk. Another thing is in terms of communication crisis, what we discovered is that a lot of the businesses were they were looking to us as economic developers to let them know this is what you should do, this is how you can change what's going on, because there was a lot of confusion. What we learned from a number of economic development organizations is they did not have secure, robust ways to communicate with their businesses. They didn't even have information so that they could communicate and reach the businesses in their community. So I think there's going to be a trend toward people using CRMs more to manage this. Let's start with looking what happened with businesses. Businesses, as soon as coronavirus hit, they had to change the way they were doing what they were doing. Otherwise, they were going to go out of business. For economic developers, we may not realize it, but we're in a very similar situation. If we don't change, we're not going to be able to be valuable and relevant. So I think that we have to resist this idea of let's just keep doing what we're doing. Another thing, and this is something that a lot of people, you hear this related to coronavirus, that says, we're all in this together. And I'm going to say, yes, we are, and no, we aren't. Here's an example of how we're all in it together. So if I'm a business owner, and there's a landlord and there's a bank. So the business owner, because revenue has gone down or they've been forced to close, they now can't pay their rent. So the landlord gets impacted by that. And so the landlord, it's in his interest to help keep that business in that space, because if they go out of business, then they're going to get no rent. So they work together to try and figure out something that everybody, can do. But if the landlord isn't charging the rent to the local business, then they still have to, how do they pay the bank? So everybody's connected, and there'd be some opportunity where, you can collaborate. But at the end of the day, still, there are financial obligations. And this is probably the place where the federal government is best positioned to solve these types of massive problems that can't really be solved easily locally. So in this way, yeah, we're all in it together, but also we are not in this together. Because if you're an agricultural worker, or you're the essential employee who has to interact with people at the grocery store, or you've got kids and you are a single parent, but the kids are going to school, this is very difficult. Or think about all of the people who are in healthcare who are getting sick because they're going to work, which is very different than the reality of if you can work from home, or you have so much money that actually you really don't need to be bothered by this at all. You don't have to work. And if you think about for the wealthy people who make a lot of their money from passive income, look at what's happened. This is just how different the reality is. This is the S&P, Dow Jones, and the NASDAQ. So the S&P basically is like, oh, the recession is over. If this is where your money's coming from, or NASDAQ, it's even higher than where it was when the downturn first happened. But this is not the experience, because we looked at that issue of how many people have wealth. So this is the argument for we're not all in this together. And this has economic development impacts. Can you throw up the next one, Victor, the next survey?
Yes.
All right, y'all. So what's this a picture of? Is this Anatalio? This is my family during the coronavirus epidemic on vacation. This is me vacation with my friend Site Selection, FDI, and Tourism. Or this is Site Selection, FDI, and Tourism about to fall off of a cliff. So Victor, you can close that out and we'll see the results. All right, so there's general agreement. Well, you guys think I'm not able to go on vacation with these pieces of our profession. So in fact, this exactly what's happening. So Site Selection and Tourism and FDI, these pieces of our profession are really in a difficult situation. And John showed some of this. Here's some more of the data that I got from WavTech. And so that 40% that John mentioned is exactly what's happening. And you can see the downturn really significant. This is for Europe. You can see it's just so massive. So now what people are doing is when it comes to FDI, they're not saying because they just can't, there's no way to achieve what we used to be able to achieve. So they're just saying, well, are we just getting our fair share? But that fair share is small. Site selection, think about it. Our business is going to make multi-million-dollar decisions without going to these locations before they make these investments. Or think about how many businesses are visiting you now, or how many businesses from outside of the country do you have meetings and visits scheduled with. It's just a really difficult situation. And when you get measured on this, the numbers are going to look bad. So with the challenges related to site selection and foreign direct investment, this also becomes an opportunity, because economic development organizations really need to prepare for the situation where these visits aren't happening, which shows the importance of digital and online site selection analysis tools and research to help foster this in the future. There's also the issue of entrepreneurship, both voluntary and involuntary. So a nice thing is people have been stuck at home. For those who are entrepreneurially minded, they're saying, okay, we're going to start that business we always wanted to start. But there's also a lot of people who are in a situation that are forced into self-work because they've lost their jobs. Now, these people need a lot of help. A lot of them don't know how to start, or how to work for themselves. And so you as economic developers need to come up with solutions that are scalable so that you can help them because there's going to be a lot of people in these situations. Another issue is that cities are an opportunity. And so where are these conversations? People are saying, well, cities are bad. People are fleeing them, big cities. This is the opportunity for rural places and the exurbs. Well, to that, I would say, yeah, maybe right now at this moment, they are less desirable. But I still think we've got thousands of years of evidence that, and if you get a chance to watch Jeffrey West's TED Talk, what you'll see is that the trend toward urbanization it's too powerful. Like nothing kills cities. Every week, 1 million people are moving to cities. And it's because of the economic networks, the benefits that come from people being together. And so I still think that cities are a huge opportunity, but there's also, I think that there's going to be new winners and losers. And this is an opportunity also for rural, suburban, and exurban places. Can you throw up the other survey, please, Victor? So if you guys can just vote. And Victor, can you close that out? So, okay, so basically 40% have never heard of it, half are not, and 20% are working on it. That's okay. So what surprises me is that even that there's almost 20% working on this. This is something that's new. We're really going to have to focus on. I'll lay it out. I'm going to publish a paper on this soon. When we look at it, the access to information and technology is really going to be a big divider. So this digital divide, we see it's impacting. So the wealthier you are, the higher the chance you have access to technology. If you are white, you more likely have access to technology, both in terms of internet speeds and also computing. For a lot of school-age kids who are poor, they don't have access to this. And this is a big issue right now when people are doing distance learning. You also see that rural communities are less likely to have access to high-speed internet. And look at the massive difference between those who don't have a high school degree and those who have college education for who has access. And this has a place impact because the communities that are more digitally savvy are places where economic development and wealth is greater. And it's a cycle, right? And it's a cycle that has to be broken if you want your community to succeed. John talked about this. We're not going back to the way things were before. And even though I know that there are many economic developers that are going to resist change and they're saying, okay, I just need to get back to doing things the way that they were before. Well, look at the businesses that have taken this approach, whether it's Kodak, Dell, Sears, Yahoo, Borders, or Blockbuster. Let me tell you, you do not want to be the Blockbuster economic development organization when there's a move toward being the Netflix economic development organization. People are going to resist this, but I think the organizations and the directors who do this, they are going to simply be less relevant and they put their jobs at risk. So the people who are going to keep their jobs, those of you who are going to keep your jobs, are going to change what you're doing. So this is the last thing I want to end with, is where some of the new jobs are going to come from. And this is as new as last Saturday. So this is new business starts. And if you look at the last recession, you can see things were pretty flat in terms of new jobs coming. And of course, there was also a dip as coronavirus hit. But look at how many new businesses are having starts. This causes me some hope. And I think that we as economic developers need to focus on this issue of entrepreneurs, because there's new entrepreneurs entering and the small businesses that they're creating. So with that, we'll come back to everybody.
All right. Thanks, John. Thanks, Anatalio. That was absolutely fascinating. Some really interesting questions have come in that I'd like to pose. And I know we're kind of pushing our luck at the end of our time, but I'm comfortable with going a little over if necessary. Let me ask this first one. This is one that came in. I think it's great. And feel free, guys, to take it, either of you. With the dramatic and accelerated trends discussed, does this change how cities should reconsider focusing on commercial tax base and jobs as the economic foundation? Or does this suggest moving more towards broadening economic development to building livable communities and quality of life, like parks, open spaces, et cetera?
So I'll go first, and then I'd like to hear what Anatalio has to say. And by the way, congratulations, Anatalio. I loved your presentation. I thought it was absolutely terrific.
Really appreciate it.
And I typed in an answer to that very question already, Aaron. So you can probably see it there. But I think I want to look at the second part of the question and maybe let Anatalio address the first part. We're going to say similar things, I think, which is that if the jobs metric was one that we should have examined a long time ago, we now need to rethink all of our expectations around taxable returns to the city and how that's going to play out. Not so much on commercial real estate. Let's make a distinction between commercial real estate on the one hand and the office market. They're very, very different. The industrial and distribution warehousing is doing extremely well. So, we need to keep that in mind. But to the second part of the question, yes, I think that an emerging role for economic development organizations and chambers and foundations for that matter is really going to be will be driven by community service agreements. I think the CSAs are going to be absolutely critical and even more so than the public-private partnership. Anatalio?
When I started, so I have a master's degree in city planning, and the last thing I wanted to spend my career on was doing long-range planning because I thought it was so slow and boring. I loved the fact that economic development was so fast, but the reality is now we all have to become city planners again because making communities great places is just going to be so important. As it relates to jobs, let's just be really practical about this. If you are being measured based on the number of jobs you're creating, and by the way, anytime I do the survey of what economic developers are judged on, it's job creation and capital investment, right? I mean, those are the traditional ones. But if you're going to get measured on this, look at the trends that we just talked about. Like, just pick the automation one. It is going to be harder and harder to create jobs, especially in the short term, but perhaps forever. So if you want to keep your job, you better think about some different metrics. I think that's me being very practical about how you keep your job. But I think for people on the call, you do want to keep your job.
Right. And I'll just add in, even in the interest of measuring jobs, that the whole remote working idea is another component of that. I mean, bringing in remote workers is bringing jobs into your community, but there's so little infrastructure for tracking remote workers right now in these economic development organizations that you don't know if they're there or not, because it's really hard to organize them. But those are serious job creation. You're bringing 100 remote workers into your community and your rural, that's significant.
Yes.
Yeah, and so here's a really interesting thing, because I think this whole issue of talent attraction can go either way. It could be a big bust or it could be a big opportunity, because understand, yes, talent really matters, but you bringing them in for what, right? Like it doesn't necessarily have to be about the building where you are anymore, because the people who are in your community now can work other places, and that money, that worker is still an export worker because they're bringing the money from somewhere else into your community.
Yep.
I also want to point out another measurement because it does address this issue. It's not related to the question, but it's related to measurement and inclusion. Is if you think about the ways that we have done a lot of measurement in economic development, it actually helps, and I use helps loosely, but it helps create more economic, basically more haves and have-nots. So one of the things that we have is, how do we raise the wage, right? How do we raise the average salary in our community? So what economic developers do, they go out and they get higher wage jobs, right? They try and bring them in or create them, however they do it. So great, but who gets the $100,000 job? Is it the poor in our communities? No, they're still not going to be able to get that job. So using that as our measurement is not so good. Another way, though, if you think about it mathematically, to increase the average salary in the community is to lift the people who are on the bottom up. So again, it's the way that we measure our profession has impacts on what we get.
Yeah, sounds great. I'm going to do one more audience question, and I have a final question to wrap up with you guys. Do you see the continued increasing costs of higher education and the rise of boot camps and online certificates altering the way teenagers get an education or the value of a college degree? Is it possibly changing the disparity in income between those with degrees and those without?
Yeah, well, so we've been thinking quite a lot about this question, and begin by saying that this notion that our economy will be driven entirely by college-educated workers was never a sustainable model to begin with. So I think we begin with that realization, and I think that business, this is where the economic development organizations has to be much more actively involved with the business community. If there's one thing that I think we can look at as a takeaway for the way EDOs can function, economic development organizations will function in this new environment, is to open up an entirely new level of dialogue with businesses. When I look in Anatalio, I'm sure you've had the same experience, Aaron, you have too, their actual engagement with the companies in their community are always slow and unresponsive in terms of the actual needs that those businesses have and the kind of dialogue that they welcome. Now, what that has to do with this question of education is to have an active discussion, not around workforce programs and how a workforce program does or doesn't fit, but what the actual needs of that business are going to be long-term, not just in terms of who they're going to hire. So you begin a larger rethinking of this question, and then skills and educational attainment can take a different path than they have in the past. And we can give some very specific examples of that. But I have a lot to say on this subject, but I want to hear what Anatalio has to say as well.
Yeah, and I wish you would have talked about, you and I have talked about this in other settings, about this issue of the skills that people need and how we're always behind as a profession. Like we're trying to solve a problem that's, by the time we get the solution, we're on to the new problem. So, and I think that is certainly part of it. Another issue related to this and how we're learning and the online learning, because certainly I think online learning is going to change some of the economics of universities. I mean, I hope so, because the cost is just becoming so much. But we need to think about who's going to be able to access it. I'll just tell you my story from my kids' first week of remote learning. So on the first day, so I'm in California, we've got fires going on, and the 2 hours into their first day of school, the power went out. So of course the internet went out. So, and that's the only way that we could access remote learning, right? That's it. And I was quite inconvenienced by this. That's my polite way of saying it. But guess what? There are a lot of people. In my home, I have gigabit access. I have very, very high-speed internet. And that's normal for me. But there are a lot of people in communities who don't have access to high-speed internet, period. And they can't afford it, or they don't pay their bill and then internet is gone. And so all of these things, we need to think about the economic development impact of this. So I'm talking about in terms of schools, which matters, but it also matters in terms of jobs, right? So I'm digressing a little bit from the question, but this issue of how do you have remote workforce if you don't have consistent internet, or who can afford it? All of these things are things that in the new normal for economic development, we as professionals have to engage this. And I'm writing about this. Hopefully soon I'll be able to publish some of what I'm seeing. I showed a little bit of it today.
Yeah, that's interesting, Anatalio. And Golden Shovel's been working with a community that we've been involved with the business leaders in talking about these situations. And one of them says, I have 30 jobs available right now, but the people don't have access to the internet and therefore can't take the job. And it's not that the company be more than willing to pay for the internet. It doesn't exist. But the second part is, even if it does exist, if that internet goes down, then you're at like in one case, the company wasn't coming in for 2 weeks to fix it. They were busy. Well, that's 2 weeks of lost employment in the new normal. And so a huge issue, and now a major priority for everybody to get broadband in, for sure. And I'm curious of how 5G might leapfrog some of that. Well, I guess we'll see.
So this is a place where we've kind of punted to the private sector to solve this, but basically we have monopolies in the U.S. in terms of who provides it, and that can be a problem for, think about for the rural communities. Although there are more people in urban areas without access to broadband than there are in rural places. So
just to close out this portion of the question, Aaron and Anatalio, we're finishing up our project in Richmond, Virginia, and we are recommending there that that there's a change in the codes of the city, and that every new residential unit that's permitted, single family as well as apartment, will have access to high-speed internet. Now, we don't want to get into a big debate on last mile connectivity. It doesn't really matter from our perspective whether it's provided by 5G or whether the city has to park a van outside that gives them that 5G. It doesn't matter. You can't permit a unit without any more than you would permit a unit without sewer and water. I mean, you can't permit a residence or an apartment without running water and electricity. And so there's no reason that same can't be true. And once you mandate it, you will get a response from the private sector. And it may be a battle, but it's just to underscore the importance that you're both assigning to this. It's absolutely necessary.
I think that's a really smart idea that you guys have come up with.
Well, what we did.
Organizations should hire you so that they.
Well, so I mean, this is a way of saying let's just quit this. Let's quit the discussion. Let's quit the debate. The moment it's codified, right? You're the planner, Anatalio. You have no choice anymore. There has to be. You're forcing everyone's hand, and that's exactly what you need to do.
I think there's also a component of this that economic developers are already seeing and knowing, is that it's digital. Our future is digital, and economic development organizations which are not digital are going to suffer the same information poverty as the people in their communities. So if you don't have digital services, and I think that's why we're seeing, at least in my businesses, that people are coming there.
Yeah, thanks for going over, Aaron, because this is really, now we're getting into some of the things that I hope are going to be takeaways. Because if this debate has foundered on the question of last mile connectivity, it's an absurd way to approach it. We have Elon Musk right now putting low orbital satellites into space, basically providing the possibility of rural. And so we literally recommended to IEDC that we get on the phone with Elon Musk and talk about the profession supporting low orbital access to fiber and excuse me, to internet, and forget fiber maybe. So I think the underlying question here is that if you want to think about relevancy as an EDO, you begin with the infrastructure. You want to be very traditional here. You begin with the infrastructure, and that's the infrastructure that you and Anatalio were talking about. Without that access to it, you simply have no possibility of closing the disparity gaps that we've been talking about.
Very soon, next couple days or weeks or whatever, I'm going to be publishing something related to this issue of information poverty. I just sent everybody my LinkedIn, the address. If you're connected with me, you're going to be able to see this. Actually, with a lot of the things I talked about today, you can reach out to me through LinkedIn, and I'm happy to share them. And by the way, we talked about stuff, but we can get more into the actual, what are the solutions? How do you fix this issue as an economic developer?
Yeah, and good.
Okay, well, I know we're over a little bit. I'm going to ask one last question because I want to end on a final one, and then unless you guys got to run quick, this is just getting juicy. Next time, remind me to have a 2-hour session for our webinar so we can get more into it. For the people that have time.
Look, Look how many
watch the
people are
recording.
still here. Like, people haven't left.
Okay, we've still got plenty of people. All right, well, here's my question for you. And I mean, you guys shared a lot of information, great presentations. Thank you so much. We just went through COVID. We all got our COVID-19 information onto the websites. You know, like we went through the whole stress of all of that. Now we're here trying to figure out what's going to happen next. You guys shared a lot of ideas on where it would go. What is the most important thing economic developers should be doing now? And if you want to throw in something they shouldn't be doing, that probably would be nice too. But just kind of end on summing up your thoughts on how to give people direction where to go from some of this. How about John?
I'm telling you, you go first.
Okay, so the most important thing you should be doing is changing. Stop doing what you were doing before. You need to change. Now I'll give the 5-part answer to that question, which is, I think there's some big trends, and I'll lay them out really quickly. The first is automation, digitization, artificial intelligence, and robotics. Like, that's going to affect our profession. I talked a little bit about that already. The second is remote work, and I think John really laid that out, and he's got some even better ideas, which he's going to share with us in the future. The third is, where are jobs going to come from? And I think that people need to be focused around entrepreneurship and small business. The fourth is economic inequality, and the fifth is information poverty. So if you're not focused around those 5 things as an economic developer, your value is going down.
Thank you. John?
So we have our lawn people out mowing the lawn right now, conveniently, of course. So if you got background noise, I apologize for that. I want, because Anatalio and I have had such a long and productive relationship, I just want to I want to disagree with him on entrepreneurship and small business support. I know that is such a desirable topic, and it is what most economic developers want to hear. But I am deeply skeptical about the kind of benefits that will accrue from it. And I say that even at the risk of putting ourselves in an awkward position in terms of our own consultancy. But I think we need to look at that with a much more critical eye than we have in the past, and think about it less in terms of people starting businesses than making people productive. And that's a distinction that I think would make for a really interesting, much longer conversation, because there's a difference. The notion that a person who is creative and innovative needs to start a business is one that I think has kind of been baked into the economic development profession, needs to be re-examined. So let's leave that as a debate topic for a different time.
I'm going to debate.
But I think in terms, so in terms of the larger question of what economic development organizations need to be doing now, they need to fundamentally change their relationship to the public sector, because I think that there are creative ways in which the community itself, by that community I mean city government and county government, not state government, but city and county government, can interact differently with businesses. That's where the community service agreements come in. And I'll give you just one practical example, and then and I'll give it from Las Vegas. So the city manager there is a longtime friend of ours, and Scott Adams basically took this opportunity that COVID-19 presented, if you want to think of it that way, and said, how are we doing transactions now? What are the ways in which people are transacting a business with the city? How are they paying their bills? How are they applying for permits? And working with smart cities and with private sector internet providers, created his own call center, city call center. And what he discovered within as little as 3 weeks is that all of those interactions of the public and the private sector with the city had been the time needed to complete applications and permits and so forth was cut in half. Now, here's the interesting thing about it. It saved the city money, but it also reduced employment. Of the 22 people that were involved in those providing those services, 15 are gone. So this is part of the same complexity around innovation, reducing job counts. And Anatalio, you know, I've talked about this for the last 6-7 years. But it created that opportunity to approach this differently. And so I want to say that changing having a fundamental change in the way that EDOs interact with the public sector and with businesses is the first order of business.
Yeah, so I'll have a little bit of the debate with you right now, John. I think the issue related to small business and entrepreneurship is also that small business and entrepreneurship post-COVID or during COVID and post-COVID is going to be different than what it was before. A part of that certainly is this issue of productivity and people creating value. But I'm still very big, and I think communities should focus on this issue of the opportunity from small business and entrepreneurship, but not that means that they're going to be what they were before.
No, and I have friends on the line still, I think, who are who are going to disagree vehemently with this. But I think, and it doesn't mean, what it means is that it needs to be discussed, because the question of what we do for people who are innovative and creative, that's the question. And how does that benefit the economies that we're working in? I mean, I think in the end, what hasn't changed is that, what hasn't changed is the desire to improve the community through providing upward mobility economically. But the ways in which we do that and the ways in which we think about it, that's what's really have changed. Yeah. So I thank you so much for Aaron. It's been a pleasure, and I wish that everyone could have chimed in on this. I think there are people in the audience who know more about this than I do, certainly, and would have loved to have heard more from them.
Yeah, well, guys, thank you so much for your time, and for all the attendees that took the time today. And apologize for going over, but not too much. I really, really appreciated this conversation and discussion, and certainly have set out topics for future webinars and future discussions. There's been all sorts of thank yous from the crowd to you guys. Once again, we will have a recording available, so if you're an attendee, you will get that in your email. And please reach out to Anatalio or John via LinkedIn or otherwise with further questions. Thank you so much, everybody. Take care.
Thanks so much, Aaron. Thanks so much, John.
Thank you. Thank you all.